This week, Major League Baseball incorporated Negro League statistics into their historical record. The long overdue step recognizes the contributions made to the sport by roughly 2,300 black athletes, including players like Josh Gibson, who now leads the league in several career batting categories, eclipsing records set by legends like Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb. Joining me now to talk about it is national sports contributor for Forbes.com, Terrence Moore, author of The Real Hank Aaron. Terrence, thank you for joining us. Now, for some of our viewers who are less familiar, can you talk a little bit about the role the Negro Leagues played in professional baseball, and why it's such a significant step forward for the sport to have the statistics from that era officially integrated into the records?
Well, I mean, for the first part, the reason the Negro Leagues existed from 1920 until roughly 1960 was because Major League Baseball ran a racist operation. They did not want African Americans in the game, basically because they thought they would become too dominant and overshadow the white players, okay? And that's been the case for decades and then just forevermore, and that's a whole other story. But and that is why what I wrote today for Forbes.com, I think people are making way too much of a big deal about this as far as praising Major League Baseball. And here's what I mean by this, all right? It's wonderful that they're including these statistics of Negro League players from that era, again, from 1920 through the 1960s, but it's absolutely disgusting, the timing of this thing. Because you go back to 1969, and back then, Major League Baseball, you had the American League and the National League, which you still do, they decided on the 100th anniversary of professional baseball to include all these other leagues from years gone by. They included 4 other leagues back then, all white leagues, but they did not include the Negro leagues.
This was in 1969. They still wouldn't include the Negro League when they included other leagues, 4 other leagues.
That's exactly right. And, you know, as you know, that was 5 years after the Civil Rights Act, which tells you just how racist this thing was. And the reason I just find it so just ridiculous. Okay?
Now, let me hold you right there, because documenting the Negro Leagues have been a massive undertaking. Archivists have spent decades combing through box scores and newspaper reports, and that process continues because much of the information we have is incomplete. What is all that research teaching us, not only about baseball, but about the racial history of our country?
Well, I mean, it just shows you that a lot of this was done on purpose. You know, I was very close to Hank Aaron, and you mentioned the book that I wrote, and Hank and I used to talk about this all the time, about how I used to get him very upset, along with myself, that a lot of people misunderstand what happened on April 15th, 1947. They always say that Jackie Robinson proved with the Brooklyn Dodgers that blacks could play baseball. No, he didn't. Major League Baseball and everybody else already knew that blacks could play baseball. It was a fear factor for Major League Baseball officials, starting with Kennesaw Mountain Land as the commissioner, that they could play and they would overshadow the white players, okay, right, like a Babe Ruth and a Ty Cobb. And look what happened here, Reverend Al, with the inclusion of these stats, just instantaneously, Josh Gibson becomes the all-time career batting average leader over Ty Cobb, the white icon, and you got Josh Gibson who becomes tops Babe Ruth in all kind of slugging categories.
Now, the Negro Leagues went into decline after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. By the 1970s, this struck me, the roughly 20% of Major League Baseball players were black. By 1971, the Pittsburgh Pirates were the first team to put an all-black lineup on the field. But today, only 6% of Major League players are black, the lowest level since the 50s. Why do you think that is, and do you believe this renewed interest in the history of the Negro Leagues can help reverse the trend?
Well, Reverend Al, I'll tell you what I know. Okay, back in 1982, when I worked for the San Francisco Examiner, I did something that had never been done before or since. I did a detailed study on this. 1982, it was 18% African Americans in baseball. The all-time high was in the mid-70s at 27%. From talking to black players, white players, executives, all on the record, there were people who told me, again, on the record, that there was a quota system in Major League Baseball that was purposely phasing out African Americans. That's how I became close with Hank Aaron in 1982. And the consensus back then was, by the turn of the century, the 21st century, that the numbers would be below 10%, which they are right now. And matter of fact, I even had the smoking gun revenue. I had a white scout give me a computerized scouting report from Major League Baseball back in '82. They had a slot for race. They were keeping track of how many African Americans were in the game. I checked with the National Football League with their scouting report, the NBA and their equivalency of a scouting report back then. They did not have race on their forms, only Major League Baseball.
That's 32, 33 years ago you sounded that trumpet.